The higher a person's intelligence, the more lonely they can become. And this is not an accident or a conscious choice. Intelligent people withdraw from social life not because of shyness or arrogance, they simply see what is inaccessible to the majority. Carl Jung talked about this as far back as Carl Jung, and it's a truth that can be uncomfortable. As a person dives deeper into their reflections, it becomes more difficult for them to participate in superficial conversations, social circles, and even relationships. It is telling that great figures in history such as Albert Einstein, Nikola Tesla, and Arthur Schopenhauer avoided an active social life. But does this mean that a person is doomed to loneliness? Or perhaps these eminent minds saw solitude as the key to personal and intellectual development? Loneliness in society has always been viewed with suspicion. People who withdraw from society are quickly labeled as odd, unsociable, or even problematic. But what if this view is wrong? History shows that many great intellectuals have seen loneliness not as a burden but as a gift. While society seeks to avoid solitude in every way possible, some have realized that it can be fertile ground for intellectual and creative growth. Arthur Schopenhauer was one of the first to explicitly suggest that solitude is the lot of outstanding minds. In his opinion, genius often alienates people from the crowd, because those whose thinking is more refined, it is difficult to find interlocutors for really deep conversations. Albert Einstein, one of the most brilliant scientists in history, placed great value on moments of solitude. For him, silence was fertile ground for innovative ideas to emerge. He even claimed that the monotony and solitude of a quiet life stimulated the creative mind. This did not mean that he rejected human companionship, but he understood the power of isolation for deep thought. Another prime example is Nikola Tesla. Throughout his life, he avoided traditional relationships and distractions that could interfere with his intellectual productivity. Tesla believed that constant social interactions drained energy and distracted him from what was truly important, his inventions. But was his seclusion a choice or a consequence of his mind being ahead of its time? Here an important reflection arises. Solitude can be both a tool and a barrier. When one retreats to immerse oneself in one's thoughts, solitude becomes a space for creativity and self-discovery. However, if isolation arises from feelings of misunderstanding and an inability to connect with others, it can become a wall that prevents meaningful communication and limits development. Great geniuses have found solitude as a space to hone their ideas. But that doesn't mean isolation is always helpful. The line between genius and social exclusion is thinner than it appears. If society rejects those who think differently, is isolation a choice or the only alternative for those who find no harmony in the outside world? The truth is that some people find pleasure in being surrounded by friends, while others prefer the tranquility of a quiet space. Carl Jung was one of the first to explore this distinction in depth. In his opinion, humanity can be divided into two large groups, introverts and extroverts. Extroverts draw energy from the outside world. They enjoy constant discussion, dynamic environments, and feel more alert when interacting with others. Introverts, on the other hand, take the opposite path. Their energy comes from introspection. They need silence and solitude to organize their thoughts and regain their energy. This raises an interesting question. Why are so many highly intelligent people introverts? The explanation may lie in the way their minds process information. Those who think analytically or reflectively need time to assimilate ideas and make connections. While quick conversations and superficial interactions may be enjoyable to some, to a sharp mind they can seem empty and tedious. This is not to say that introverts don't enjoy socializing. They just prefer deeper and more meaningful exchanges where there is a true exchange of ideas. The problem is that society values extroversion. From childhood, we are taught that being outgoing, expansive, and communicative is a sign of success. Reserved children are encouraged to be more open, while introverted adults are often perceived as shy or not charismatic enough. However, this view misses an important fact. Many great historical figures drew their strength precisely from silence. Jung warned of the dangers of attempting to adopt behaviors that are not in keeping with one's true nature. An introvert who tries to fit into an extroverted behavior pattern risks exhaustion because his or her mind is not designed for the constant stream of external stimulation. Self-perception plays a key role in this dynamic. When a person understands and accepts their nature without guilt, they are better able to cope with external pressures. A preference for solitude does not indicate social difficulties. It simply indicates that one's energy is directed inward rather than outward. Perhaps this is why many geniuses have chosen introspection as a natural path. Not because they rejected society, but because they realized they needed a space free from external distractions to think deeply. In most cases, high intelligence creates a gap between a person and their environment. People with sharp minds often have deep interests, complex issues, and a perception of the world that few people share. This makes social interactions challenging, as finding an interlocutor with the same level of intellectual curiosity is a real challenge. Everyday conversations usually revolve around recurring topics, current events, and everyday trivia. For someone with an inquisitive and analytical mind, such exchanges can seem monotonous and uninteresting. A dilemma arises. These people avoid social life not out of contempt for others, but because they rarely find truly stimulating conversations. Research shows that people with high IQs tend to prefer limited social contacts. The reason is not arrogance or misanthropy, but a natural need to conserve mental energy for things that truly stimulate them intellectually. There is also a key psychological factor: cognitive dissonance. When a person realizes that their thoughts and thinking do not conform to societal norms, they can feel alienated. This feeling of incompatibility often leads to choosing silence over frustrating communication. Another factor that makes it difficult to connect with others is the high demands on the quality of communication. People with advanced analytical skills are not satisfied with vague answers or superficial arguments. They seek meaningful discussions and exchange of ideas that broaden their worldview. The price of genius is often loneliness. Not because these people deliberately isolate themselves, but because the world can't always offer them the type of connection they seek. Thus, solitude becomes not just a social preference, but a necessity to prevent mental overstretch. Highly intelligent people tend to have a heightened sensitivity to their environment. Excessive noise, crowds, forced conversations, and frequent interactions can be extremely tiring. This overstimulation doesn't just drain their energy, but can cause true mental exhaustion. Their minds are in a constant state of activity, analyzing information and identifying patterns. While many people can socialize without feeling particularly tired, those with sharper perceptions need periods of rest to organize their thoughts and prevent emotional burnout. Carl Jung explored this connection between intelligence and sensitivity, arguing that the more aware a person becomes, the more intensely they feel the emotions and heaviness of the world around them. Deep introspection expands perception, making a person more sensitive to what is going on around them. This phenomenon is especially noticeable in so-called hypersensitive people, a trait often found in intuitive and thoughtful individuals. These people don't just observe their environment, they absorb it. They pick up emotions, intonations of voice, subtle expressions, and even energy vibrations that most people don't notice. This heightened perception can be a real advantage, as it allows for a deeper understanding of other people and the world around us. However, it can also be a source of constant overload. The mind of such people never turns off this emotional and sensory radar, which makes prolonged socializing, crowds, and superficial conversations particularly exhausting. In addition to the emotional impact, there is also a physiological effect. Studies show that hypersensitive people experience more intense nervous system activation in response to common stimuli such as noise, bright lights, or multiple interactions. While most people cope with these factors without difficulty, those with hypersensitivity experience severe fatigue after social events and require longer recovery times. The problem is not limited to the physical aspect. The psychological need to adapt to the fast pace of society can be a real-time drain. Many feel the constant pressure to participate in interactions that do not fit their natural lifestyle. When these individuals try to withdraw to conserve energy, they are often perceived as cold, aloof, or indifferent. This social judgment creates constant internal conflict. Meet expectations and be depleted, or honor your need for solitude and be misunderstood. For many, this incompatibility becomes unbearable over time. Emotional exhaustion from excessive socializing leads to the almost inevitable result of alienation. Not because of a lack of interest in others, but because maintaining a constant social presence would mean sacrificing one's mental well-being. This is why it is important to understand this mechanism in order to avoid the trap of extreme isolation. Hypersensitive people must learn to set healthy boundaries, recognize when they need to retreat to recuperate, and ensure that this estrangement doesn't turn into constant escapism. Ultimately, respecting one's own nature is essential. There is nothing wrong with needing silence to organize one's thoughts. But how do we reconcile this need with a society that imposes hyperconnectivity? We live in a world that values publicity, fast communication, and intense socialization. Success is often measured by the number of connections, constant attendance at events, and the ability to interact with anyone at any given moment. But this vision of social interaction doesn't suit everyone. For those with a deeper appreciation for life, the pressure to be always available can be depressing. The need to maintain superficial conversations, engage in forced socializing, and adapt to a frantic social rhythm can cause significant mental fatigue. There is a misconception that more withdrawn or introspective people are antisocial, arrogant, or even depressed. However, not everyone needs constant socializing to feel happy. The problem is that society elevates extroversion to an ideal. From childhood, children are encouraged to be outgoing and sociable, while those who prefer to observe and reflect are pushed to be more open-minded. In the work environment, those who talk more and put themselves on display are often perceived as more competent, even if they don't have much knowledge. This model creates conflict for more introspective people. Trying to conform to it can lead to severe emotional exhaustion, so much so that some choose to withdraw from society altogether. Carl Jung had already criticized this obsession with constant interaction. He argued that most social relationships are superficial and few are capable of having truly meaningful conversations. In his view, the search for self-knowledge requires periods of solitude, for it is in silence that one can truly hear one's own thoughts without outside influences. But being different from society doesn't mean being wrong. Everyone has their own way of interacting with the world, and there's nothing wrong with appreciating solitude as long as it doesn't turn into extreme isolation. The real challenge may not be to conform to an imposed social model, but to learn to honor one's nature without guilt. After all, are those who choose solitude really losing something, or are they simply protecting their energy in a world that demands a lot but doesn't always give something in return? Being alone does not mean being lost. Chosen solitude is a space of freedom, a refuge where the mind can expand without external interference. Society often associates loneliness with social isolation, but this view is wrong. Those who allow themselves periods of solitude are not necessarily rejecting the world. They are simply creating an environment conducive to introspection and personal growth. Silence provides a unique opportunity for reflection without external distractions. It becomes possible to observe your thoughts with greater clarity, recognize your emotions, and understand what is truly important. This process is fundamental for those seeking inner growth, as it allows them to explore their personality without the influence of other people's expectations. Loneliness acts as a catalyst for creativity, but it is in balance with human companionship that ideas find life and meaning. An excess of stimulation and social contact can fragment attention and prevent complex thoughts from developing. Conversely, a mind that gets enough quiet space can see the emergence of innovative concepts more clearly. But there is an even deeper dimension to the experience of solitude. The freedom to be completely yourself without seeking the approval of others. Many spend their lives adjusting their behavior to social expectations, seeking external approval, sometimes to the detriment of their own selves. However, learning to be at ease with oneself allows one to realize that true acceptance comes not from others, but from oneself. This path corresponds to what Jung called individuation, the process that leads each person to a full realization of his or her unique personality. Detachment from worldly noise does not mean escaping from reality, but rather creating space for free development without undue influence. However, the freedom that solitude gives exists only when it is a choice. When it arises out of fear or frustration, it can become a prison rather than a springboard to development. It is therefore important to distinguish between loneliness and isolation. The former is a state of inner wholeness, while the latter can be a reflection of suffering and disconnection from the world. The real secret will be discovered in balance. To be able to appreciate moments of introspection without completely disconnecting from others, to use solitude to strengthen the mind, understand one's emotions, and reevaluate goals without falling into the trap of being too withdrawn. Because true freedom lies not in the number of people around us, but in the ability to be at peace with ourselves, whether alone or in company. Being alone can be a liberating experience, but it can also be a burden. Loneliness can be a conscious choice or the result of unintentional alienation, and it is this difference that determines whether it becomes a source of growth or an obstacle to well-being. Voluntary isolation occurs when a person consciously chooses to seclude themselves for reflection, study, creativity, or simply to organize their thoughts. This choice is motivated by a desire for self-discovery and introspection. It is healthy solitude where one feels comfortable in one's own company. In contrast, harmful isolation occurs when one becomes alienated because of feelings of not fitting in with the world, not being understood, or being rejected. Rather than being a refuge for development, such alienation becomes a barrier to meaningful connections. So how can you tell if solitude is helpful or harmful? The answer lies in its effect on your emotional and mental state. If solitude brings clarity, calm, and creativity, it's probably a healthy choice. But if it brings sadness, apathy, and emptiness, it may be time to reconsider. Another key factor is duration. Temporary estrangement can be refreshing, but prolonged loneliness without human companionship can take a toll on mental health. A lack of meaningful connections can lead to emotional isolation, making it difficult to return to socializing. Therefore, a balance between loneliness and social connections is essential. While it is important to respect one's need for solitude without guilt or social pressure, it is also important not to cut all ties, as development occurs not only through self-reflection, but also through socializing with others. In the end, the real challenge is not to avoid loneliness, but to use it wisely. Not every lonely person is necessarily smart, and not every smart person is necessarily lonely. However, there is an undeniable connection between deep thinking and solitude. The analytical mind needs space to develop. With constant exposure to superficial stimuli and repetitive interactions, it risks dissipation. This is where solitude becomes a necessity for those seeking to deepen their intellect. But does deep reflection really require solitude? It all depends on the balance between inner and outer worlds. Those who allow themselves moments of solitude can better organize their thoughts, reflect without interruption, and nourish their creativity. This time alone with oneself is crucial for intellectual development, as it allows one to think independently, without external influences. However, the danger lies in turning this alienation into permanent isolation. It is easy to believe that solitude is the only way for those who seek knowledge and development. Some even avoid social interactions not by choice but out of frustration, convinced that the outside world has nothing to offer them. This is one of the main risks of prolonged isolation, a gradual loss of connection to reality. When a person stays in their bubble for too long, they lose the ability to compare their ideas with other points of view and enrich their thinking through dialogue. Carl Jung warned of this danger. He emphasized the importance of self-reflection, while reminding us that personal development is based on a balance between internal reflection and external interaction. Excessive isolation can lead to mental rigidity, an unwillingness to accept new ideas, and the illusion that solitude is the only answer. Another trap of isolation is developing a sense of intellectual superiority. When a person withdraws because they don't find stimulating socialization, they risk falling into the belief that no one around them has anything interesting to offer. This way of thinking can further increase his isolation by cutting him off from valuable perspectives. So how can we avoid these pitfalls? The first step is to realize that intellectual depth does not preclude the simplicity of human interaction. Not all conversations need to be stimulating or philosophical to be of value. Even light conversation can provide interesting insights into how others perceive the world. Being present in conversations without the constant expectation of intellectual discussion can make these moments more enjoyable and enriching. Another approach is to actively seek out environments where intellectual exchanges are encouraged. Instead of casual connections, it can be more helpful to join groups or communities with similar interests. Today, thanks to technology and access to information, it is easier than ever to find social circles where critical thinking, creativity, and reflection are valued. When one is in an environment where intelligence and introspection are valued, communication becomes natural and authentic, without having to sacrifice the quality of discussions or feeling forced to isolate oneself. It is also important to practice active listening and develop genuine curiosity. Often the feeling of a lack of interesting interlocutors has more to do with how we approach communication than with the actual lack of stimulating personalities around us. Asking the right questions, being genuinely interested in the perspective of others, and being willing to step outside of your own intellectual bubble can turn even the simplest conversations into enriching exchanges. Learning comes not only from those who share our worldview, but more importantly from the contrast between different ways of thinking. Moreover, finding a balance between introspection and social interaction helps us avoid both mental overload and extreme isolation. Moments of solitude are necessary to organize thoughts and deepen ideas, but it is through socializing that these ideas are tested and strengthened. Being able to determine when to seclude oneself to maintain mental clarity and when to allow for easy socializing without requiring depth in every conversation gives great flexibility in one's relationship with the world. Intelligence should not be a factor of separation, but a tool to maneuver quietly between different forms of human interaction. Learning to manage one's need for reflection without rejecting simpler experiences may be the key to a more balanced life, where solitude is an ally but does not become a confinement that inhibits personal development. The secret lies in how we use loneliness. It should be a tool for growth, not an absolute refuge. Time spent alone should serve to nourish the mind, structure thinking, and deepen knowledge without minimizing the value of human companionship. True intelligence is not limited to the ability to think deeply. It also includes the ability to balance self-reflection and connection to the world. Isolation may be necessary to develop critical thinking, but it is communication, challenges, and new experiences that allow it to stay in motion and evolve. Ultimately, solitude should not be seen as a prison, but as a space of freedom, a place where the mind can breathe, strengthen, and return to the world with an even clearer vision. Being smart doesn't mean avoiding social life. It means knowing when it's time for solitude and when it's time for socializing. Solitude can be a burden or a gift. It all depends on how one treats it. If we have learned anything here, it is that withdrawal from the world is not a rejection of social life, but is often a response to the need for deepening, reflection, and personal growth. The greatest minds of history have found in solitude fertile ground for the maturation of their ideas. But it was in the exchange with the world that these ideas found life. Silence, far from being empty, is often the most fertile environment for creativity and self-discovery. However, excessive isolation can become a trap. When one completely cuts oneself off from the world, one risks losing touch with reality and missing out on important lessons. Therefore, balance is essential. Carve out time for self-reflection while remaining open to socializing and human connection. The real question is not whether smart people avoid social life, but why they do it. It's not always a conscious choice. Sometimes it's just a natural reaction to a world that seems too noisy, too fast, too superficial. The connection between loneliness and intelligence is deeper than commonly thought. Understanding this dynamic is essential to leading a more authentic life. The dominant social model doesn't fit everyone, and learning to honor your need for silence and reflection can bring a real sense of freedom and mental clarity. If there's one thing we should remember, it's that loneliness is not to be feared. It can be a valuable ally. Making time for solitude allows you to focus and get to know yourself better and make more genuine connections with others. Now I invite you to apply these reflections to your own life. Observe your moments of solitude and analyze their impact on your ways of thinking, perceiving, and behaving. Find the balance between self-reflection and communication and see how it can enrich your personal journey.